Evening, everyone. This is Andrew, and welcome back to episode 12 of the true story of how I became the All-American boy in Vietnam. And in episode 11, I explained that we had taken off from Dong Ha. Our original intent was to go up to where the 101st Airborne was and play for them. But the fact that I had blown up my amplifier and we couldn't really perform, we got on a plane and went to a place, as I recall, called Phang. And golly, it was a beautiful place. A beautiful, beautiful place. And, it looked like a typical Air Force base in Vietnam where we flew in. But we quickly got into half-ton trucks, and we went up to this headquarters area of the Army. And I just want to jump back a little bit to explain that Swarzynski, our guitar player, had continued on from where we got dropped off in Phan Rang. He went on to Saigon with my blown up amplifier to get me a replacement. And so there we were in this beautiful area. I mean, golly day, it was gorgeous. There were acres and acres and acres of lawn in what was, at one time, I believe, excuse me, the headquarters of a French rubber operation. Now, the rubber operation in Southeast Asia was, it's all Henry Ford's fault, because there was a demand back in the early 20th century for unlimited amounts of rubber. Rubber had started off as as a phenomenon. The people in South America used latex to make a ball that they used in their athletic games, something like soccer. And it was, what's the word? A curiosity. But when it became clear that an American, Charles Goodyear, had discovered by mistake that you could put latex from a tree under a little pressure and combine it with sulfur, and whammo, you got a new substance called vulcanized rubber that would withstand cold without cracking and withstand heat without melting, which is something that latex wouldn't do. But this vulcanized product allowed people like Henry Ford to use it to make tires for automobiles. And the demand for raw latex just exploded. And the French were taking advantage of that. They had tried planting rubber trees all over the place with no substantial results. But in South Vietnam, they discovered that in the Central Highlands, like Pleiku, where we've mentioned before, that rubber would grow like a weed. So they planted row after row after row after row of thousands, millions of rubber trees, and they forced the Vietnamese into abject slavery, harvesting that latex. And the story in Vietnam was that the French had forced the Vietnamese people to become the fertilizer for uh, the capitalist monsters that were taking over Vietnam and taking all of the wealth right out of the country. But one thing that they did do was, as they drove higher and higher up the trail away from the beach, uh, there in Phan Rang, they got to higher altitudes where the winds blew. I guess they were trade winds, and they would blow in from the ocean and cool the place off, and it was just delightful. And so the French, uh, early, like 1900, 1910, they built this colonial palace there, up in the foothills. It was surrounded by hundreds, thousands of acres of rubber plantation, but right there where the boss's house was, there must have been 50, maybe 100 acres of lawn. I'm talking about mowed grass. It was exquisite. It was, I don't know, it was, those of you who have access to the internet, you can look for the Biltmore Castle back in Asheville, North Carolina, and that would give you an idea of the scale of the magnificence of this colonial residence that the Army had taken over for its headquarters, and it was the operation of the Special Services that was there. And that's where we were to meet Alphabet with the new amplifier to prepare us to go on for our next performance, which was, we had skipped our performance up at Camp Eagle and had gone directly to Phan Rang, where we were to play. I forget who was there, but anyhow, we basically had nothing to do, no rehearsals, no real nothing. So I went to the headquarters, this colonial palace, and was just poking around. And that's when I heard the news story that Dong Ha had had been blown to smithereens. The NVA had gone in and hit the ammo dump. Oh, huge explosions. Well, anyhow, being stuck there with nothing to do, I smoked all the pot that I wanted and drank all the coffee that I wanted, and wandered into the headquarters, and lo and behold, there was a library. And on the shelves of the library, there was history. And I dove into the history of that area and discovered the absolute and utter devastation that the French had brought to the lives of the Vietnamese people in that era and that area. And as I learned about the colonial system that the French had set up, it became crystal clear to me why Ho Chi Minh and his band of patriots, Vietnamese patriots, they literally hated the French and wanted them expelled from Vietnam. And, in World War II, the Japanese had come in and taken a bad situation that the French had developed and they just made it worse. And they were pushing those poor Vietnamese people into producing more and more and more rubber. And it's a sad, sad situation. And you can understand why these people who had been occupied, these South Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese people, had been occupied by Japan and by China and by the French, and the Dutch had had their people in there. It had been under battle for control for hundreds and hundreds of years. And South Vietnam, or Vietnam, was still producing rice and feeding the people in southern China who could not feed themselves. So it was not a happy, beautiful existence, in spite of the fact that it was a happy and beautiful land. It was just fantastic. So there I was, reading history of Vietnam, and that was pretty bleak, and just waiting for Alphabet to get back with the amplifier. And I think it was right about this point in the tour, very early in the tour, that I alienated myself from my fellow band members, because as I recall, being led by the drummer, I never had much relationship with the drummer, and he suffered. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. The man was the first person I had ever met who had a legitimate 1,000-yard stare. I mean, we could be having a conversation, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking 1,000 yards beyond me, waiting for death to come. And he was, looking back, I think he might have been suffering from a traumatic brain injury, because he had a lot of the mental deficits associated with that kind of brain injury. He didn't concentrate well. He had a very bad short-term memory, and a number of other things that we could get into. But he escaped from his mental torment with alcohol. And he got the singer, Anthony, and Earl to go get drunk. And I didn't like getting drunk, because it messed with my alcohol high. And they confronted me, and I confronted them right back. Basically, go flip yourself. And so they went to go drink, and I went to smoke more pot by myself. And that sort of created a fissure, a crack that would widen and grow more defeating and destructive to the band. And I was just a jerk. I was supposed to be playing music with these guys. I was supposed to be making friends. I was supposed to be having a good time. None of that was true. None of that was true. I was just a punk, a selfish, self-centered egotistical half-baked guitar player. But one thing that was cool was that every now and again we would get it, and there was just this mountain of opportunity to play soul music. And I didn't really know much about James Brown at that time. The only song that I knew by James Brown off the top of my head was a ballad called Try Me, Try Me. And I didn't like it very much, but, he's an entertainer. And then Anthony, the singer, introduced me to James Brown's song called I Feel Good. Do 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 do, like I knew that I would. Do 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 do. Except his version was different than the version that I had learned on the radio. His version really rocked, and had a great horn parts and great bass part and a cool guitar part, the rhythm guitar part. I never heard of a rhythm guitar part like that. We went way up on the neck, and the only thing the guitar was supposed to do was to create this rhythm figure. Well, if this were a movie, we would insert that song right now, the band playing that song. So anyhow, later that night, Alphabet showed up with that amplifier, and we kind of played a show that was not really very good because the lads were drunk, and sad news. Well, I'm going to let this episode expire, and we'll come back tomorrow with something more uplifting and more entertaining than just sitting, waiting around, reading history, and being depressed by the fate of the Vietnamese people under the control of the French and then under the control of the Americans. Because basically, I think that the Americans were harder on the Vietnamese culture and the Vietnamese economy than the French had ever been. But we'll develop that in another episode. So as for this evening, as I try and remind my friends, don't forget to breathe and come back. And if you've enjoyed the stories up to now, I hope that you will find the like button on the page and press that like button. And if you really like it, you might want to subscribe. And whenever I put up a new episode, it'll ring the bell on your phone or your device, I guess I should say. So anyhow, as I like to close, I say, peace out, brother. God bless. See you next time.